All right, so here are some compression and dynamics processing tips for beginners. Ignore all talk of compressor types and specific formulas and numbers until you can actually effectively use whatever compressor that you happen to have. All of this other stuff is just trivial detail stuff that is not going to serve you aside from just confusing the out of you by giving you way too many options. Just focus on the main concepts and learn on whatever compressor that you have that came with your DAW. All this talk of different compressor types and when to use specific compressors and everything is just, that's going to benefit you when you already understand compression and you're, pretty good at using it. But until that point, it's just going to be extra confusion and stuff that you don't need to worry about at this point. So fucking don't worry about it. If you're still learning, just have fun and tweak some knobs. It's going to be way more fun than trying to memorize a bunch of stupid bullshit. Would you want some flashcards or something? Just fucking don't worry about it. Have fun. Use presets as a starting point to learn how different settings can affect things. So like you might go online and you'll read a bunch of stuff, from people like, oh, use a 4:1 ratio on your fucking whatever the fuck. Don't worry about that. Just go through your presets, like all the ratio and attack and release times. You'll start to see trends for like specific presets. Like you'll see like punchy snare drum and you'll be like, oh man, everything that's about punch is kind of set a certain way. That's interesting. Just, you need to be careful with presets to adjust the input volume going into the compressor because as I said earlier, compression is all about how you're pushing into the threshold. So be conscious of that. If a preset is expecting a certain volume of signal and the signal you're feeding it is like way less or way more, it's not going to sound the way that it was intended. So you can't use a preset as a crutch and expect it to work for your specific use, but you can use it as a starting point, and I highly recommend that. And you can also use it as a way to just explore how things sound. This setting sounds like this setting sounds like that. Explore, experiment, tweak some knobs, and have fun. If you're still learning how to use a compressor, I highly recommend using something with some sort of graphical interface that kind of displays what's happening. You don't want to use it as like an accurate depiction of what's going on. You always want to use your ears. But if you have some sort of visual representation of what you're actually hearing, it can help with the learning process. This is absolutely not crucial at all by any means. You can use stuff that just has some knobs on it. No fucking problem, as long as you're listening for the changes that you're making. But if I were to make a recommendation for a third-party plugin, it would have to be FabFilter Pro C2 just because it sounds great. It's very, very flexible. I can put it on anything and it actually shows you exactly what it's doing at all times, which is, it's pretty nice. If I could only use one compressor plugin for the rest of my life, it would be FabFilter Pro C2. Level matching is super important. So anytime you use a compressor, you want to adjust the output volume so that it matches the input volume. You basically don't want to be fooled into thinking that the processing you're doing is actually making an improvement just because it's louder. So basically, you just want to remove that booby trap because you will automatically think a louder signal sounds better. And this is just a way to put the before and after on even footing. So just remember, compressing is not meant to change the volume, it's just to control the dynamic range. You control the volume with the track fader, so always level match any sort of signal processing video. But there are no rules, so do whatever you want. Controlling dynamics is often best approached in various subtle stages rather than trying to cram everything into one process. But you generally don't want to do too much gain reduction unless you want a super drastic effect and you want to hear that compression. Most of the time you don't. Don't be afraid to be heavy-handed when you're first learning how to use compression. A common mistake with compression is actually underdoing it. That's how I basically came up, I was just basically afraid that I was going to break something or just over-compress. And basically every time I've had any sort of breakthrough of learning how to use compression, it's like, oh, I'm not using enough. Oh, I'm still not using enough. Man, I'm still not using enough. I think that's a pretty common thing. Just you gotta manhandle that shit sometimes and just, get it in a headlock and just be like, you're not fucking moving, bitch. And then you've got better control over it that way. If anything, it's easier to back off of too much compression than to keep continually tiptoeing up. Am I hearing it? Am I hearing it? If you don't know, you're probably not. So you can actually overdo it so you can really hear it and then just bring it back. And then even if it's still too much, like if you send it to somebody to give you a mix grit and they're like, yo bro, too much compression, at least you can hear it so you can bring it back and then you'll get an idea for how much to use that way. Dynamics processing can be affected by anything that happens earlier in the chain. So like say you've got a compressor on your master bus and you do something on the snare bus, like say you add 250 hertz or something with an EQ, that's going to adjust the volume going into that compressor that's on the master bus. So you have to be continuously conscious of these things. And this is another reason why you always want to level match any of your processing. So like if your goal isn't to change the volume with your processing, you should make sure that it does not change the volume. With compression, the faster the attack or lower the attack time, however you want to look at it, the more control you exert over the signal because it's reacting faster. So with a slower attack time, you're allowing more of the signal to pass through the compressor before the volume comes down. So in that way, you can emphasize the attack of the signal because you're dropping everything after the signal. You know, the transient happens, triggers the compressor, but the compressor is reacting slowly. Basically, with a slower attack time, you can let that whole transient through. So like on a snare drum or something, if you want that snare drum to be punchy, you set a slower attack time, let that fucking transient through, and then the compressor just stomps on the fucking sustain, you know, to however much you want. You don't have to absolutely kill it, but you stomp on the sustain, and then that's how you can emphasize the attack, because then you can bring up the entire volume of the snare track, and then suddenly you have a louder crack on the snare drum. Or if you want more body, you do the opposite. Do a faster attack time so that it, like as soon as that transient hits the threshold, that compressor is dropping the volume down, and then you've got a quick release time as well. So it's basically just reacting to that transient, smashing down on the transient, coming back up, and then suddenly all that tail, the sustain of that drum, is brought up to a louder volume. And that's how you can make a drum sound longer or have more sustain. Some compressors will only have 2 knobs. And don't worry, all that same shit that I explained before is going on. It's just kind of under the hood and you can't control it, but that's fine. There's still a threshold and you've got the 2 knobs. One of those knobs it'll usually be called like gain reduction or compression or something like that. And basically all that is an input knob. So it's turning your input signal up. So you're pushing it into the threshold. So rather than controlling the threshold, you're controlling the volume going up into that threshold. There's usually no attack and release on this. If it's a 2-knob compressor, the other knob is going to be like a makeup gain. The plugin industry loves compressors. That's why you see like hundreds of them all over the place, but they're really only modeled after like a handful of compressor types, and these are all based off of the same handful of hardware units usually. So you see all those like LA2As and 1176s. People get really fucking nutty about their compressors and they will collect hundreds of compressor plugins and they'll have a specific use for each one of them. I don't really get that crazy. Like I'm pretty much down to use like a handful of compressors really. And if I have to, I'm totally fine using stock stuff because it's better to know one plugin really well than to have a fucking armada of plugins that you kind of occasionally use every once in a while. You don't want to just become a collector. It's not good for your pocketbook or wallet or whatever. I have a wallet. I don't have a pocketbook.